Thanks, Mark. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking an hour or so out of your day to come and hear my talk on the survey of the territorial boundary between Northwest Territories and Nunavut. I am Dagen Deslauriers, and I am, as Mark explained there, I'm also, I guess, a part-time Arctic explorer. So a little introduction on what it is we're going to talk about today. Presentation length is about 30 to 40 minutes. So during that time, we'll have a brief description of what the project was and who was involved. A little discussion on why the project was even necessary, being the remoteness of the location. What did we actually do out there? How we did it, how we executed the work. Some of the challenges that we had to overcome to complete the task. And we'll set aside some time at the end if you have any questions or comments that weren't covered by the presentation. So the project itself, this is a historic cadastral survey of part of the boundary between Northwest Territories and Nunavut, conducted in one of the most remote locations in Canada's high Arctic. The project limits themselves extend from the southeast corner of the Tuttanogat National Park, which is basically the deflection of the orange line down here, and it goes across, heads easterly across Victoria Island here, deflects north at 110 degrees west longitude, and continues up Victoria Island, Melville Island, Mackenzie King Island, and finally to Borden Island. To give you an idea there, the furthest point of land on Borden Island is over 2,800 kilometers from here. So you don't just exactly come back to the office to pick up supplies, if you know what I mean. So the project scope itself, it required a physical survey and the monumenting of approximately 883 kilometers of land boundaries separating the two districts, as well as the photogrammetric mapping of 98 kilometers of natural boundary. Of course, natural boundary consists of the high water mark of rivers, there's a lake, and of course of the ocean as well. The reason for the mapping, of course, is because just the time constraints. Mapping takes considerably less time than physically surveying the high water mark of 98 kilometers. We would still be there. And then finally, the preparation of the deliverables, which, of course, the survey plans, which will be registered in the Canada Land Survey Record, the associated field notes, and the final reports. So the project team that completed the survey, of course, was myself and one other Canada Land Surveyor, Colin Atkinson, as well as a survey technologist, Glenn Zelenik, and a helicopter pilot from Canadian Helicopters out of Inuvik. The field survey was completed actually in two separate trips due to deteriorating weather last fall in August. We intended on completing it all in August, but that didn't happen. So we went back up, we remobilized this spring, and it was completed in June of this year. So, in addition to the field team, the project required a lot of office support from a number of skilled technologists, helping us out with adjustments to daily logistical support, data processing, drafting, and of course quality control. So why is this project even necessary? It's way up north, almost to the middle of nowhere. Who's interested, right? So from a survey perspective, surveyors like boundaries, they like certainty in boundaries, and this survey definitely accomplishes that. When it comes to the boundary as it currently is, not monumented, well, it's monumented now, but it's currently subject to the interpretation of three separate land claim agreements, the Nunavut, the Inuvialuit Final Agreement, and the Gwich'in Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement. And it's by description within these agreements. So this will eventually be updated to reflect the surveys and other surveys that will be performed to monument that and finalize that boundary. So this survey will essentially be the framework for all future surveys which reference the boundary. From an overall national perspective, the funding for this project was part of an ongoing program for the federal government to assert sovereignty in the region. Of course, you know, the Arctic is rapidly changing, and access to some parts of the Arctic is expected to increase as a result of things like climate change, improved technologies, better icebreakers, that sort of thing. Some of the industries that stand to benefit from this are the shipping, the oil and gas and mining, and as well the tourism industry. The first cruise ship successfully made it through the passage this year. So with the increase in interest in the region from a territorial perspective, for the territorial governments to know the extent of their jurisdiction is important for them to balance the potential investment opportunities with responsible environmental management, conservation, and consultation with local communities and their aspirations as well. So, what did we do? We touched on it briefly there a few slides back. Physical survey and monumenting of 883 kilometers of land boundaries separating the two territories. We utilized the Global Navigation Satellite System, GNSS, formerly known, everybody would know it as GPS equipment, exclusively. So we used it on all the islands. That was the only technology that we used aside from the mapping. The legislated boundary, as I mentioned before, is defined on the older NAD 27 latitude and longitude mapping datum, which is rather difficult to survey using modern methodology. And of course, the markers must be placed on the NAD 27 boundary using the new technology. So that required a non-linear conversion between the two mapping datums. And this conversion is now done by the software in the office. So we also completed the installation of the brass caps and markers as shown there, every 10 kilometers or less. The 10 kilometers was the maximum limit per the project scope there, but we had flexibility to shorten it to account for topography. Basically, we tried to keep the markers on the highest points because putting them in low areas, they could be subject to frost heave and getting pushed up out of the ground. So a marker sitting on the ground beside you is not going to do you a whole lot of good. Nearly 100 of them were installed over the 2 field seasons. As you can see, it's along quite the area. And then, of course, the recording of the sufficient observations to confirm. So, as I touched on earlier as well, we also completed the photogrammetric mapping of 98 kilometers of natural boundary. And of course, the natural boundaries include the lakes, rivers, the ocean. The natural boundary surveys were located by a combination of project-specific tasking of the SPOT 6 or 7 satellites and what that did is that acquired a high-resolution color stereo imagery, and then we also had to complete a field survey of photo identifiable points on the image, and survey some a few hundred meters of the high water mark to confirm the location that we picked off the imagery. Once the imagery is adjusted to the ground survey control I was talking about there, the office work can begin to delineate that line of the high water mark for plotting on the survey plan. So, and that's done in the office after we get back. And finally, the preparation of all the deliverables to be registered at the Canada Land Survey Record. In total, there are 6 plans to complete this area, and of course the associated field notes and final reports. The survey plans show the monument locations as well as the coordinates, the distances between them, etc. The final survey reports that get sent in include things such as the equipment used, the survey methodology, things like the terrain, like high-level reports on the terrain, the access, and any issues that would have affected the survey. And then at the end there's tables that include the adjusted final coordinates for all the monuments, the survey control network adjustment and results, and then of course the photographs of each of the installed monuments. So based on how far away it is, how do you survey, or how do you do anything in the far north for that matter? Well, it quite obviously takes extensive pre-planning in the office. Things that we had to consider, of course, were logistics, getting our people, equipment, supplies up to our base of operations. Where are we going to stay? What are we going to eat? How are we going to get to where we need to go? Based on the distance from base to the boundary, how is the helicopter going to refuel, get back? As well as some fairly rigorous safety and emergency planning. And then finally, after all that, figuring out how to actually execute the survey in a time-efficient manner. So we'll touch a little bit on each of those points there as we go along here. So on the list, the first challenge on a survey like this is to determine a base of operations for a project area that extends linearly 1,700 kilometers. So the only suitable solution, as you can see there, is Ulakaktok on Victoria Island. If anybody's familiar with the region, it was formerly known as Holman. The main reason that we chose that place over any others is it was the most northerly location that we could get to with a regularly serviced airport, a hotel with restaurant or kitchen, a grocery store, and like a co-op for other supplies, possibly, as well as fairly standard telephone and internet capabilities to determine or to communicate with the office and our families and such, right? Ulakaktok is located approximately 1,900 kilometers due north of Edmonton and is serviced primarily by air only, when weather permits, from Inuvik or Yellowknife. It also gets barge service once a year for major container shipping, but that's not something that we were able to take advantage of. So this presents fairly significant challenges to get equipment and supplies there, since flights are only 3 times a week. The flights are serviced by smaller aircraft, not your 737s. And as such, then, because the aircraft is smaller, there's a priority loading sequence to get on the plane itself, right? Which this loading sequence can easily be backlogged by sustained periods of poor weather. So the order of boarding would be, of course, people paying passengers, emergency or healthcare cargo, and perishables. Each person gets to bring 1 bag on as priority bags, and then everything else falls into general. So that's where the backlog can come up. And of course, as luck would have it, I was delayed in Inuvik trying to get across the Gulf, the Amundsen Gulf there for 3 days, waiting for a window to open. So there was quite the backlog. So what is Ulakaktok anyways? Well, as I mentioned, it's a small hamlet on the west coast of Victoria Island. It's a traditional northern community with a population of about 400. It gets temperatures into the teens at the height of summer when the sun doesn't set, and mid-40s or worse under total darkness. Traditional main sources of income for the northern communities: hunting, trapping, fishing, arts and crafts. And I guess now, after this year, we can look to add tourism to that as well. Fortunately for us, it's also home to the world's most northern golf course, where you can play anytime, day or night, under the midnight sun in the summer. That sounds actually like an advertisement. So it's a full 9-hole course on the open tundra where you hit off with mats, and the greens are made of AstroTurf. the rocks and shears along the course there mean you never really know where the ball's going to land. It's going to bounce and it's just going to go. And to top it off, you got a flock of ravens or seagulls that are just perched there waiting for the ball to stop moving so that they can come down and swoop it up. I guess they think it's an egg or something. So as a result, golf balls command quite the premium in the community. So if you ever find yourself going up that way, make sure you take lots of balls. So for operations on the Canadian mainland and for the majority of all of Victoria Island, the only suitable hotel, like I said, was in Ulukaktuk, the Arctic Char Inn there on Victoria Island. It's a pretty basic standard 8-room inn with a kitchen, and you know, the amenities and the staff were, of course, overly accommodating and great, of course. And in town there's the grocery store and the co-op to load up on emergency supplies and keep the helicopter stocked up. Or in the event you get back late and the kitchen's closed, then have a granola bar for dinner or something. However, the accommodations at the far north were a little bit more rustic and not for the faint of heart. So on the screen there is a photo. This is the Government of Northwest Territories polar bear cabins. We stayed at one on Melville Island up in Cape Province. We stayed there for about a week to complete the surveys on Melville, Mackenzie King, and Borden Island. It's got 4 bunks, a camp kitchen, and a table, and a furnace, and that is it. These things are built, they're scattered all over the north. They're built primarily for polar bear research, and that typically happens in March and April. And in the rest of the year, it's open for use for guided hunting trips or crazy surveyors or whatever. So it's obviously an extremely remote field camp, so we had to be self-sufficient. Adequate survival gear, communications equipment. The nearest assistance we had would have been approximately 500 kilometers to the east at Resolute there. So with the weather in the region, you know, Resolute help could be a week away or 2. So obviously we had to charter in sufficient sleeping bags, food, water, generator, fuel for the generator, heating oil for the furnace. You know, the food consisted of primarily non-perishables and, you know, dehydrated packaged food. So not exactly the 4 seasons, but pretty close. So the obviously very remote location. The only real way to get anywhere is by helicopter, or as the pilot called it, he was the air taxi. That one there. The one we used was an A-Star, which carries approximately 2.5 hours of fuel on board, which is good for 300 to 400 miles. But with the significant distances we had to travel from town to the line and then back and forth to do our work, there isn't enough fuel to do all of that and then get back. So the only way to utilize the helicopter to do all your work is by strategically placing fuel or other caches along the boundary line. But what is a cache? What's a fuel cache? In this case, it's drums of jet fuel and other supplies as necessary, strategically positioned by the third-party air charter, as you can see there. That's Ken Boric Air. So before we mobilized, we did a pre-survey, pre-planning exercise, desktop evaluation, if you will, which considered things such as distance from town, with the fuel on board at the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day, the amount of work we expected to complete in a day, and then what our return travel is going to look like to get back. So typically you leave full, do your work, stop at a cache, fill up, and get back. And that was a pretty typical day. So anyway, at the beginning there, we pre-plan the locations and pick approximate coordinates based on based on our plan, and send them off to the charter company. And then they load up their plane with the fuel and fly to the approximate locations. Then it's up to them to find a suitable landing spot for the plane, land, drop the drums, and then send back the actual coordinates of the cache rather than just the planned ones. So you can imagine that you're putting a lot of faith into the charter company coordinates, because if you're flying there and you're almost empty, and you get there and the fuel isn't there, you best be ready to hang out on the tundra for a few days while you wait for fuel to show up. So, and as luck would have it, that did actually happen to us up on Melville Island, which is completely uninhabited. We flew into a cache, no fuel. Fortunately, our planning had another cache about half hour, 45 minutes away, which we had enough fuel to get to. But say it's a very real concern. So obviously this is a high profile, but it was also a high risk project that required a very robust safety plan. And really, I think the first requirement was that those of us that went up north had to be just a little bit crazy to even do it. Working in the high Arctic can be very challenging. Of course, you got weather considerations, wildlife, lack of mobile communications, isolation, terrain conditions, all create lots of hazards. The safety around the helicopter is probably the greatest hazard. Movements around an idling helicopter are fairly dangerous. You know, you have your rotating blades, downdraft. You know, typically you try to land in a fairly flat place, but there could be, you know, uphills or hills very close to the helicopters, so you gotta watch where the blade is when you're loading and unloading equipment, right? Wildlife encounters, pretty serious. They can occur very quickly. Necessary, of course, to pay attention before you land, and then when you get out, to avoid attracting unwanted wildlife. On the mainland in the south part of Victoria Island, there are grizzlies. Moving north, polar bears, Arctic wolves. They probably pose the greatest danger. Common to see all of them, actually. Surprisingly, it was more grizzlies than polar bears at that time of year. But, you know, as well as other wildlife, muskox, Arctic fox. Anything you can think of is probably saw it. I've noted slips and falls here. It's a pretty standard one, but you don't think of it as much of a hazard. But when you consider the fact that you're a minimum 3, 4, 5 hours away by helicopter, you know, if you take a serious fall, you know, you're a long ways away from help. So it makes it difficult to walk in the muddy and soft conditions. So same thing with the installation of the survey monuments. You know, it requires pounding in the posts or drilling them into rock or whatever. So there's same thing applies there. And then of course exposure, right? Like you got fuel issues. You could possibly have mechanical issues with the helicopter, whatever. So you need to be. There's always a possibility of being stranded for several days. So extreme weather conditions can come up. So you've got to be prepared to stay overnight for considerable lengths of time if required. We did go in August last year, which you would think is a fairly good time of year to go, but August weather up there is already well into late fall. So you have a few decent days here and there, just the same as you would here, but primarily it's a coastal area. You get low-hanging cloud and fog and drizzle, and temperatures in the 0 to 5 degree range. So staying overnight on the land is not exactly going to be pleasant if you're stuck out there. So, and then transportation by helicopter itself, that required a whole separate risk mitigation strategy. And in order to manage those risks, we, from the office, we have a check-in, check-out daily procedure, a safety procedure for all of our field crews. So we're not exempt from that, of course. So the office staff had real-time tracking of the helicopter location. So they could ping the location of the helicopter at any time. On board the helicopter itself, it had its own, in addition to the satellite communication for the tracker, it also had emergency locator transmitter, pop-out floats, which you can see, they are the little gray bags on the side of the ski there. It's basically an airbag that's triggered, that can be triggered by the pilot. And they're designed to land, of course, in water and keep the helicopter afloat in small to moderate waves. So not a foolproof strategy, in the event of high seas, but that's what those funny looking orange suits are. Those are the full Sea Arctic immersion suits that had to be worn by each occupant when traveling over the water. And they're basically thick, heavy, uncomfortable hypothermia protection suits in the event of the failure of the floats or the helicopter. If you got to pile into the raft, you want something to help you out. So it's waterproof. It's probably an inch of insulation and completely watertight. So it's got the hood and zip up. You can zip the face shield on and everything. So other things that the helicopter had on board, of course, firearms, outdoor survival gear, extra food and water, and then longer term emergency rations. As well, we also carried we each had a satellite phone as well in case we need to make emergency communication. So finally, just to touch back on actually executing the work again, we talked about it a couple times already, but each boundary location consisted of a brass cap and T-bar marker, and there was about 100 of them to put in. So we used redundant and adjusted GNSS or GPS techniques exclusively to measure and coordinate the boundary line. So how we did that was selected points along the line were coordinated using what is called the precise point positioning technique, service that is put out by Natural Resources Canada. So what is that? That's you visit these selected locations first and occupy them for 2 to 4 hours at the beginning of the project. And then you take that observation data back and upload it to the system, which uses continuously active reference stations to coordinate precisely that location, hence the name. So from there, then we go back out and we're armed with high accuracy coordinates to start our survey from, and then from there it's just traditional set up a reference base and then a roving receiver to complete the actual installation of the monument itself. Some of the challenges now. Well, of course, logistics are one. Careful logistical planning is required both at the onset and with daily adjustments to ensure the helicopter and fuel and labor costs don't escalate, but also to have enough contingency to allow for the daily adjustments based on the continuously changing weather and production rates. Many times we found that we would be, so if this is our home base here, we would review the weather systems that were active on 2 islands, or on the island and the mainland, and some days you would get one window to cross the Gulf and get to the mainland, but then the next day was no good, so then you have to go hop across the Sound and go to here, or hop up over here, or whatever. So every day had a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, depending on the weather. And you just kind of made do with whatever the weather gave you, that's where you were going. So that takes me off to the next challenge. By far the biggest obstacle to overcome was the weather, as mentioned. As I said, by August we were well into the fall season up there, so temperatures, coastal region 0 to 5. So there's just some days you just can't do anything due to low clouds, rain, fog, freezing drizzle, all of which creates no-fly conditions. The Ulakuktuk itself is, of course, a coastal town, but it's surrounded by bluffs all around, not fairly high, 5 to 800 feet, 5 to 800 feet. So if you got really low-hanging cloud, you just simply can't get up and over, or you just can't, because you always fly under the clouds, visual flight rules. So you just can't just fly up and over and hope. In addition to that, the weather can also change very quickly up here, challenging even the best logistical plans. There isn't a lot of extra fuel at each of the caches, as I mentioned, to allow for multiple trips back and forth. As an example, one day was scuttled after flying 3 hours to the towards the north tip of Victoria Island. Fly for 3 hours, hit a wall of fog that went all the way to the water. Try to go around it a little bit, but really at the end of the day, you're just turning around and going back. So 6 hours, fly there, turn around, come back, do nothing. From a survey perspective, one of the challenges is dealing with the geomagnetic activity. This is a master's level thesis in itself, so without getting into too much detail, when charged particles are ejected from the sun and they arrive at the Earth, they cause disturbances in the geomagnetic field, right? These disturbances in the ionosphere can decrease the precision of the locations of the points determined by the GPS, and the intensity of the disturbances can change day by day. So some days are worse than others. Some days it's just a minor annoyance, and other days it shuts down the survey completely, as you can imagine. So with that said, obviously that causes delays in acquiring the precise positions to place the monuments along the boundary, because the software works to resolve the distorted positions. So there's also the possibility that those distorted positions cause a monument to be placed in error. So that would only be caught by a field quality control process, which requires 2 separate observations at least 30 minutes apart. And what that does is that allows the satellites to reconfigure and take another observation. So if you get 2 observations that are relatively the same within a certain accuracy tolerance, then you're good to go. If not, then you sit there and wait and do it again in another 30 minutes until you're confident that your location is sound. So even though we had an aggressive schedule that we didn't meet in August and had to go back for to complete a lot of the surveying, we still had time to see some pretty amazing scenery. It's an amazing place. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But we still had, like I said, some time to see some amazing scenery. The trips back and forth, we took a different flight path every time because we have that flexibility. We even did some fishing for the Arctic char and even had some time for some golf. So the picture on the left there is just an example of some of the bluffs in and around Victoria Island. And the one on the right is La Roncière Falls in Tuktoyaktuk National Park on the mainland. I didn't realize, but that's actually a fairly popular tourist destination. There was camps all over the place up there. So, interesting country we have. So to wrap up, this was a historic cadastral survey of part of the boundary between the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, conducted in one of the most remote locations of the Canadian high Arctic. And it was a challenging exercise, as mentioned, high accuracy surveying, project management, logistics, safety, and quality. It's like I said, it was a once in a lifetime opportunity, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I would definitely head back to the region if other opportunities presented themselves. So.